All right, hi. I'm Scott. I'm with the 309 Punk Project, and we're doing our big fundraiser right now, trying to raise some money for 309. But I know that you don't want to hear these constant fundraising pitches. So instead, we're going to give you some programming. So we're going to talk to one of our really good friends, Mark Gubb. Mark is a professor at the University of Worcester over in Worcester, England, and has been teaching over there for, well, I'll let you introduce yourself in just a second and tell you a little bit of your background. But we met Mark over at the University of University of California in Los Angeles at UCLA. They had this really big punk conference, and just kind of randomly we ran into you, Mark. We had just gotten lunch, found the cafeteria, and then we're looking for where the conference was supposed to be, and we happened to bump into you and Rusty Black at that time. So we're grateful for that, because you brought a great friend into our life. So you want to introduce yourself, Mark?
Yeah. So I live in Cardiff in Wales, actually. So, we live in this funny little island where we've got kind of four countries all very kind of closely attached to each other. So, so I live in Cardiff in Wales, but teach in Worcester in the Midlands in England. So that's, for context, it's about a 90-mile drive from where I live. And I've been arguably an academic for 20 odd years now, teaching in universities. Actually at Worcester for only the last 6. I was in Nottingham before that. But music has been the kind of main driver within my life. Like, I'm a visual artist. Sorry, I should chuck that into the mix as well. That's kind of what I do. But I think, like most visual artists, I only really decided to become a visual artist when I realized I wasn't going to become a rock star. And so it was kind of at the tender age of 21, I took myself off to art school because I've kind of deemed my musical career to be over. And but music is still kind of really central to the core of what I do as an artist, to be honest.
Well, speaking of music, how'd you get into punk?
Do you know, like, I have to say that I arrived at punk through heavy metal. It was my cousin, I think, introduced me to Iron Maiden when I was 8 years old. I had a cousin who was 14 at the time, and he put on their 1983 Peace of Mind album for me, and I was just completely blown away by what it sounded like, and also, the covers, obviously, Eddie and things like that. It's what an 8-year-old's eye want to see, right?
Who doesn't?
And so, like, I kind of loved Iron Maiden, and then kind of very quickly actually started kind of getting heavier and heavier, and so kind of ended up in the world of Slayer and thrash metal and things like that. And then it was realistically through that I kind of ended up into Napalm Death and kind of British what are now called grindcore bands, but would have been called hardcore bands at the time. And so that was kind of really how I ended up in punk, if you like. And so, as that kind of musical view expanded, of course the Dead Kennedys came into view and things like that. But then it was also, for me, New York hardcore, to be honest. And so, because again, I was a big Anthrax fan, and suddenly, like, you see Scott Ian wearing these t-shirts with this funny NYHC logo on it, and it's like, what's that all about? And so, like, I became quite a big Cro-Mags fan, and through that, kind of bands like Prong, which are kind of on the edge of what you would arguably call like punk or hardcore, but certainly came out of that scene in New York. And so it was really, it was that. Like, I kind of ended up in this world very much through metal, and now I kind of totally exist within the two. Like, I'm still very much a heavy metal fan as much as I am a punk fan, to be honest.
Well, it's an easy transition, from one to the other, and they're basically simpatico, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So what was your first gig? First one you went to?
My very first gig ever, I'm going to go totally local with this. It was a band called Scavenger, who were just a local band where I kind of grew up. And so there was, like, where I grew up was like right on it was a kind of a seaside town, not near a major city at all. Like, I grew up about 70 miles away from London, but it was like the wrong side of London. So it was where no bands would tour where I was living, and no culture really happened where I was growing up. But what there was, bizarrely, was quite an active scene of bands, I suppose. This is what comes out of there being nothing to do, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
And people pick up instruments. And so my very, very first ever gig was about a local band called Scavenger, where I think at the age, I was maybe 14 at the time, and I convinced my mum and dad to let me go to one of the local pubs, which was like a rock punk pub. And totally illegal for me to be there at the age of 14, but like my mum and dad were quite surprisingly cool about it and let me go. So yeah, that was my first ever show. But
so what was your impression?
I loved it. Like, I absolutely just loved everything about it. And I think that the impact of the live music experience is something I talk about a lot when I'm talking about visual art, and actually that kind of the capacity to try and recreate that through visual art. Like, I mean, I know we'll come on to sort of talk about some of my projects a bit, but actually, the kind of work I make, I'm not really interested in making things to hang on walls in galleries specifically. Actually, there's what I try and do as an artist is offer something much more experiential than there's nothing wrong with hanging things on walls in galleries, can I just say, but actually what I want to try and offer is absolutely to do with this culture that I've grown up in of live music and kind of bright lights and the rock show and the dynamics of the kind of live gig and all that kind of stuff. And so yeah, it was genuinely, I know it's a cliche to say, isn't it, but genuinely hooked from that very first gig that I went to. Just this kind of the whole overwhelming experience of being in a room, a slightly scary experience of being in a room with a bunch of quite drunk people jumping about to really loud music. Like, it's nothing to beat it, right?
Well, I think that's one of the differences between punk and heavy metal too. Is it not that there aren't smaller heavy metal shows, but there's a lot more punk shows. And maybe with that ethic, that goes into punk, that might be a little different than heavy metal in general. Although people could make an argument against that too.
No, totally. Like, because again, like most people, like I immediately formed a band. Like, I bought a guitar then when I was 15 years old, and me and a bunch of friends at school formed a band. And the first gig we ever did was it was a punk show, although we'd already decided we were going to be a heavy metal band at that point. But it was a punk show because, again, it's the beauty of sort of small local scenes, isn't it? Is that there's well, I mean, I'm saying this was certainly my experience growing up, is that there wasn't huge divisions between punk and metal and these different things. It's just like we all just wanted to play shows, and so like you'd end up on these bizarre bills where you'd have like us trying to be a thrash metal band, and then the next band on would be like a grindcore band, and then the next band on after that would imagining that they were Motley Crue or something, and so our first ever show was just like a real kind of DIY punk show in a local community hall, of course, like everybody's show, right? So yeah, it was fantastic.
Well, yeah, it's a lot like over here, in Pensacola as well. If you go to the shows, that quite often you'll see a pretty broad range of acts. Some will be an acoustic musician will come on first, and then after the acoustic band will come on, then some hardcore band will come on, and after that, there's a pop punk band, and whoever's around, and you don't need to. I mean, you'll see it sometimes in some of the clubs. That not now, of course, because of COVID, but normally in regular times you would see it where there might be a skinhead over here, and then there's somebody with a mohawk over there, and then there's a hippie over there, and it's like, we're all we got. So what do you do?
And it's only as I've got older that I've kind of realized how almost odd that was. And of course there's not anything odd about it at all, but with hindsight it almost looks odd in terms of how we now understand the kind of tribal nature of music scenes and things like that. But because where I grew up, it was really I was just a couple of towns along the coast from a town called Margate, which is quite well known in the kind of whole punks, the kind of mods and rockers kind of scene, in that everyone knows of Brighton and the kind of like the mods and rockers things there, and then Margate was almost like the second in command, if you like, in terms of places where mods and rockers would go on bank holidays. And so there was always this history to the town, and so you would go to the pubs, and exactly as you just said there, like what we would see as a rock pub, essentially, there'd be a bunch of skinheads in the corner over there, there'd be a bunch of punks in the corner over there, there'd be the metal kids in the corner over there, and mostly everyone getting on fine. Of course there would be those kind of youthful over exuberance would lead to the occasional kind of disagreement, but mostly the scenes just all kind of rubbed along next to each other, absolutely no problem.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see that too, and maybe it's because of the areas, but also the general acceptance in punk, in those areas that might not always translate, and depends on the cities too. You can go to other places as well, and I have friends in other cities, some of the bigger cities, and they'll say that the hippies and the punks would never be in the same room together, and sometimes, but there's always that fine line between that. Sure. But yeah, city to city, and it makes it really an interesting culture though.
So
how would you define punk? That's like the biggest question in the world. And
yeah, right.
Puts everybody on the spot.
I almost want to refuse to answer that question. I don't know. I would just go quite cliched and quite broad in terms of it just being like an approach to life, right? Like in like an open, accepting DIY, getting on with it and making things happen approach to life. I think sort of not necessarily a total rejection of the mainstream, but certainly not being bothered about trying to go with the fashions of the mainstream, and actually just kind of really understanding the agency that you have for yourself, and being able to kind of make things happen through that agency. I guess somewhere in the midst of what I've just rambled there, I think is probably what I see punk as being, really.
Well, I like that definition too, where you say that it's not necessarily a rebellion against the mainstream, but more of of just I don't care, about it. I just like it, ignoring it and continuing to do what you want to do, and trying to figure out how you're going to do your own work, and that fits into DIY, into the DIY culture as well, where it isn't always a rebellion against it, although there is the rebellion part of it, but not necessarily all that, that it's building your own world out of this.
Absolutely, yeah. Like the thing you want is not necessarily there, so you go out and you make it for yourself. And actually, there's kind of an amazing experience to be had in that, right? Actually, just kind of getting on with it, and even where it comes down to shows, like booking your own show, putting your own posters up, handing out the flyers, those kind of things. Actually, the creation of all of that artwork, it's that stuff. It's absolutely that stuff which just turned me into the visual artist I am today. Like I was the one when we were 15 years old who was cutting up the newspapers to make interesting and funny posters that we could go out and fly post to promote our gigs. And at the time I thought I was just mucking about, but I've come to realize that I was kind of learning my trade in many ways.
So how do you translate this into your academic work?
With a huge dose of hindsight in many ways. No, interestingly, or maybe not so interestingly, like I've just come to the end of a PhD where I've literally just submitted it in September, where I was looking back over about 14 years worth of work that I made. And actually what that allowed me to do as much as anything is I realized there was a project that I worked on back in 2005, which I knew was kind of important in terms of developing my own research, actually, what is genuinely research rather than just making stuff. But it was only in the position actually of being able to look back at it now in the lineage of the other things that I've done over the last 14 years to truly understand the value in that. And what that work was, for example, was I put on this show in Nottingham, funnily enough, when I was living there. There's this beautiful little venue there called the Nottingham Boat Club, which is exactly as it sounds. It's a kind of a clubhouse for like on the River Trent, which runs through Nottingham, for a local boating club. But it's been there since the 60s. And it's one of those weird little places where when there weren't established gig venues all over the place, loads of bands played there. If you look up this place, like the Sex Pistols played there, Black Sabbath played there, Deep Purple played there. I think Led Zeppelin played there. And it's a 250 room capacity boat club. That's all it is. And so I was kind of fascinated by the history of this place. And I put on this project where what I did, because I knew Black Sabbath had played there, I put on a Black Sabbath tribute band in this venue, because through another project that I had done, I had met a guy called Jeff Lucas, who was Black Sabbath's first ever roadie, and also a chap called Phil Myatt, who used to run a club called Mothers in Birmingham back in the late 60s, early 70s, who, of course, knew all these bands that came through at the time. And so the event I put on was me on stage interviewing Jeff Lucas and Phil Myatt about those days, followed by a Black Sabbath tribute band. And so from like an academic research point of view, which I wasn't doing at the time, but I now kind of understand what I was doing kind of on some other level. I was really interested in creating a space where, like, I was doing it as an artist. I was interested in the idea that if you put on, for example, a Black Sabbath tribute band in a venue that they used to play back in the 70s when they were playing that music, is there something almost more authentic about that as an experience than going to see Black Sabbath now play in an arena? Because it's that 70s experience that we hanker after, isn't it? And so that's what I was interested in doing, and also the idea that as an artist I would put on that event and I could promote it to artists who might come to that event because they're also artists and are interested in it from that point of view. But I also promoted it to the local music scene, of course, because who wouldn't want to hear those guys being interviewed about those days and see a Black Sabbath tribute band? So in doing so, I created this space where an arts audience and a music audience could come together and experience exactly the same thing, but they were maybe coming at it from very different perspectives. And so that was really kind of like the start of me, I guess, understanding for myself that there was research within this. You know, there was something more going on here than just putting on a show and enjoying it and going away again. Like I was trying to figure out something about the audience experience and the kind of possibility of creating those kind of spaces. So.
Wow. Well, that's a really interesting thought too. You know, one of the things I've always thought every time I listen to Black Sabbath, and I, especially if I watch one of those old videos, you know, with all the melting walls behind, you know, they play War Pigs or Iron Man. I always imagine like, what would it have been like to be in that room when that's happening, or just to think, like that is so different than almost everything else that was out there at that time. Just to be there right when I am Iron Man, and just to be there at that time. So I can imagine.
Really. Well, the funny thing is, I mean, I won't bore you with all the stories now, but like I say, I still am in touch with Jeff Lucas, who was their roadie, and he's of course full of stories from that time, and of course everyone hated Black Sabbath. This was the thing, you know, like actually if you were there at the time, and he's got stories of him and Geezer Butler being chased through Birmingham city centre because they were long hairs, you know, and like that was not okay in Birmingham in the 70s. But then like one of my favorite stories I have of this kind of like iconic moment in Sabbath's career where he was there for the writing of Paranoid, but how he tells that story is he kind of missed it, because actually what happened was Bill Ward needed some cigarettes, and so said to Luke, can you nip to the shop and get me some cigarettes? So he went out for like 20 minutes, and when they came back, they said to him, oh Luke, we've written a song while you've been away, and played him Paranoid. And so they wrote it in the 20 minutes whilst he was out buying cigarettes. So,
one of the greatest songs ever too.
Yeah, right.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, so speaking of songs and speaking of music and bands, one of the things that, or the big thing that we saw you perform over in Los Angeles when we met you was this spoken word piece that that Rusty Black did with you, and as part of a project that you did. And I got the book here. See if you can see it. This is a book that I saved. You got a couple copies of it. God So Loves Decay. So can you tell me about that project and what it's about and who it's about?
Yeah, for sure. It came out of, you know, as a visual artist, quite often an invitation might come through from an arts organization based in a particular town or city and say, can you come here, you know, make some research and then make a project out of whatever you turn up. And one of my go-tos when I get an invitation like that is to go to a town and like look at the music history of that place, you know, and actually and I had such an invitation from an arts organization called Sunridge Avenue Projects in Luton in the UK, and so went there, and I knew already before I went there that UK Decay were from Luton. They're very famously from Luton, and so I kind of knew that I wanted to sort of look into their legacy and history. And so how that project then developed is I was put in touch with Steve Spon, the guitarist from UK Decay, because he still lives in the town and is absolutely, you know, actually, if you want to talk about punk, like he's almost like a perfect example of what I think sort of punk is, in that he's still in Luton and he's incredibly active in supporting the local music scene and things like that. You know, he's still there and he's still doing it. And so it really, like, kind of lovely guy. And so what I decided to do was, I was kind of interested in this idea that what is it? They were kind of, you know, I suppose there's the whole conversation is, are they punk or are they post-punk? But you know, that's another conversation to be had. So it's kind of like 77-ish when they were kind of like most of their stuff was coming out, and I really like the idea of taking the lyrics that they wrote within this town and somehow putting them back out into the town. Because if you look at UK Decay's lyrics, you know, they are kind of they do look at the kind of experience of being, not all, but they look at the experience of being a young person kind of getting by in the UK in the late 70s. And so this idea that I could take those lyrics and sort of put them back out in the world today, and what that would mean, like put them back out into the same space. And so the project that I then developed was, as you say, working with Russ, who kind of goes kind of formally under the name of Russ Crime Wave. And Russ is someone I've known for years, from when I kind of was in bands as a kid. And I got him to preach the lyrics of UK Decay in Luton Town Centre, basically. And
so when you say preach it, though, because I saw it, so tell me what you mean when you say preach the lyrics.
So I approached Russ and said that I wanted to do a kind of almost like a sort of a street preachery kind of approach to this, where we would turn up in Luton Town Centre. There's this amazing spot right in the centre, in front of the town hall, which has a really interesting history in itself, because it was burned down after the First World War in some Peace Day riots, all to do with kind of mass unemployment and things like that. So there's this real kind of very energetic, very political history behind Luton Town Hall. And so what I did was I produced that book that you've got there, which is essentially kind of a collected publication of UK Decay's lyrics, and produced it like a little prayer book, essentially. And we had multiple copies, which Russ had in a little suitcase next to him on the street for people to be able to take. And he stood in the same spot for 4 or 5 hours, I think it was, essentially kind of street preaching the lyrics from this book. And it was really quite an extraordinary experience. I mean, the kind of another part of the context to the site that we used is that there are kind of quite radical religious preachers use that spot as well, and so it is known as a spot in Luton where these kind of actions are kind of undertaken. And so yeah, we kind of pitched up there. He preached for 4 or 5 hours, and then we left. And so,
it's amazing because over here if you live in Pensacola long enough, one of the things you'll come across without any time is street preachers. People yelling at you all the time, telling you you're going to hell for this or that, or really in your face. And it's definitely part of the local flavor, if you want to call it that, over here. And when the first time I went to the UK, I was shocked to see a street preacher over there. I was like, what? They're everywhere. Yeah,
that's it. And generally in town centres like that, town and city centres in these kind of places. And so it was really interesting to see how the audience, sorry, it's the wrong word to use, the general public kind of responded to it. Because again, this is another, talking about the kind of academic side of kind of what I do as an artist. I'm really interested in this idea that you can take something, kind of put it out into a landscape, and you don't have to tell people that it is art, in inverted commas. Actually this thing can just happen, and how the audience then discover this thing and interact with that thing becomes kind of almost a fabric a piece of the work. They're by stopping and engaging with Russ in that moment, they're activating the work in some way, and becoming a part of it, and then they pass on their way. Kind of sort of almost kind of embodying the agency of the work, moving on, and then maybe telling somebody else about it, and this thing kind of then exists within the ether in that way. And so, but how people responded to it was, I guess, exactly how you might imagine, that the majority of people kind of were walking past. This was a Saturday morning, kind of in a busy town centre, so most people would just kind of shuffle past, maybe give him a bit of a glance and keep on going. But then there were points when a couple of people would stop, and then a small crowd would gather for a moment, and then they'd pass on their way again. I guess much as they do with religious street preachers, I suppose. That's really how we were trying to kind of frame this thing, though we didn't go as far as making him look like a religious street preacher. He looked, he's all dressed in black. He looked every bit like a punk musician in many ways. But yeah, the kind of the response was quite authentic, I guess, to those kind of experiences that we have anyway.
I would imagine if I were to walk over there and see him, he's a pretty big, imposing figure too. So to see him giving this sermon, if you will, probably my first thought would be, this is a part of the Bible I'm not familiar with.
Yeah.
Probably people are a little dumbstruck by the moment, just being caught in that second.
Yeah, that's it. And of course, and the fact it was lyrics that he was reading, they really lend themselves to that that kind of association as well. You know, they sound like Bible passages when you're reading through, and actually, even to the point, some of the lyrics are, you know, they really kind of almost ape Bible passages in certain sections, and so yeah, there is that kind of resonance there anyway. And so,
speaking, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go for it. Yeah.
I was going to say, well, this is a good place for me to play a little bit of UK Decay for those who might not have heard them before. So we picked out this tune. Let me see. It's For My Country. So.
Count of the memories will go back again. For the honour, I don't know why His Majesty's pleasures may honour to die. For my country! For my country!
All right. So I want everybody to be able to hear it just in case they haven't heard UK Decay before.
And also, I guess I should sort of contextualize the title of that. So on the front of that book there, you've got God So Loves Decay. I kind of called this work. And that came about specifically because on UK Decay's first ever, it was a split single, the first record they ever put out. And it's a picture of them stood in front of a local church. And on the church wall is that Bible quote, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. And so I made another work kind of around that. And then actually, so when I came to this, I sort of came up with my own version of that, which is God So Loved Decay. And so that was how we arrived at that title.
So what did the band think of it?
They really liked it. They were really supportive. So there's only, I believe it's 2 of the original members. So the singer and the guitarist are in the band now. And Steve Spon, the guitarist in particular, he was the one that I had any contact with. He really couldn't have been more helpful in terms of kind of sending me lyrics that he had so that I could kind of compile this book and things like that. And obviously I gave him a bunch of copies of the publication, and he and sent him a load more because he asked if he could have some more to give out to other people. So again, incredibly generous and really, really supportive of it. I think thankfully they understood, I believe, what I was trying to do with it. You know, it's because it's difficult, isn't it, when you are using what is fundamentally somebody else's creativity in a work of your own. There's, of course, I am always doing it from a position of respect. You know, I wasn't trying to lay any claim to UK Decay or their lyrics or anything like that. And so, but and they clearly got that, which is great. But you know, because it's also very easy to find yourself on the wrong side of that conversation where someone just thinks that you're maybe trying to kind of use their name or use their creativity for your own ends in some way. But yeah, they kind of got that I was genuine with it.
Nice. Well, do you see, I know that you look at this as art, but also, do you see this as historic preservation?
Do you know, I do. That was why I ended up, when we met at the conference, the specific focus of that, wasn't it, was kind of punk as archival method.
Yeah, archival, yeah.
And I really do, you know, it's sort of, it's that idea, like I say, of kind of taking the lyrics and kind of reactivating them in some way. I do believe that there's some kind of preservation within that. You know, I guess like any big music fan, I'm quite nerdy and kind of a bit soft about how important these things are. And so, which is why I actually really connected with your project. You know, when I kind of spoke to you a bunch and then came to your presentation, what you are doing with the 309, I so strongly believe in it. Like, it's absolutely vital that we need to do these kind of things, because, you know, it's sort of from someone the wrong side of the pond here, like hearing that CBGBs is being allowed to be let gone. You know, It's like I tear my hair out at stuff like that. I really do. That these things can get lost in that way. And so yeah, I really do. Sort of that idea of trying to kind of preserve and acknowledge.
Pause. You paused in that last part.
Sorry. So yeah, that kind of preservation of all of this stuff I think is absolutely vital. And so there's definitely that element to the work that I make with this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's one of the biggest reasons why we got involved with this. As when from the presentation, and probably a lot of people out here know this as well. That one of the reasons we decided to start the project was because the house was under threat of being destroyed. And it's not that that 309 was the only punk house for sure, and wasn't the only repository for this stuff. But it had a lot of history in the house, but it's not the only one, of course. But that said, it's part of it. It's part of the story. Just like UK Decay is not the only punk band, that's there. Maybe not even the only punk band, in the city as well. But it's being able to preserve this and giving these works a whole nother life. That likely I'd say wouldn't exist otherwise, but it changes it and lets people see it in a whole different way than they would have otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's exactly it, isn't it? I know that's certainly the case with that work. There's a lot of people sort of attached to the art side of my professional existence who've never even heard of UK Decay before, or the kind of importance of them within the UK kind of punk scene and that kind of stuff. And so yeah, there's that whole kind of new audience that can be opened up to this stuff.
Yeah, and that's one of the big things that we wanted to try with this project as well is not only to save everything, or as much as we can to save and preserve the past, but also to look into the future, to be able to project this out there. So not just so it's what's happening here right now in Pensacola, or not just Pensacola, actually all over the world, really. In fact, your book is going to be in our archives as well. So it's part of this history, and we want to be able to preserve that, of course, but then also for people to see examples of people that are taking it to the next level. So so there'll be other generations, and whether they call themselves punk or whether they're in different scenes, that it's broader than that. To me, I see it as part of a larger DIY community, and those DIY ethics are what can allow us to continue to create incredibly artistic, beautiful stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's about understanding where this stuff came from as well, isn't it? And I don't mean that in any kind of like older guy sort of the youngsters need to understand. I don't mean it in that way.
Everybody wants to hear that, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. But it is important to know actually kind of where this stuff's coming from, isn't it? Because, like say, the house you've got there, I'm sure, I mean, I don't know Pensacola specifically, but I'm sure it'd be very easy for that to be redeveloped, or kind of whatever happens in that area there. And then so suddenly then this incredibly important thing, which has played such a major role in music within the city, is just kind of snuffed out in a matter of weeks. And then once the generations who passed through that house have gone, then it's literally forgotten. And so we have to preserve this stuff. We really have to preserve this stuff. And so I think it's honestly, I can't wait to actually come and see the house. I'm determined to get there one day. I really am.
We can't wait to have you over here. So as soon as the pandemic's over, as soon as the COVID's over, then we'll get you a plane ticket. You'll come in. You'll be one of our guest speakers. All right, in person, so we don't have to do this Zoom stuff anymore.
Yeah, that sounds brilliant.
All right. Well, Mark, I really appreciate you joining us here. And do you have anything you want to add?
No, not at all. Just thanks so much for having me again. So it's an absolute pleasure to be in any way useful or associated with the project that you've got going on there. So it's all the best with it.
Oh, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate it. Okay, so let me go ahead and get this in. Here's the